Welcome to Who's Number One. I'm Trey Wingo. In golf, it's the Masters. In football, Super Bowl. Cycling, Tour de France. These are time-tested, time-honored, set your calendar for the marquee events of their sports. And in tennis, the Tiffany of tournaments is Wimbledon. We all know by heart the ritual of center court, face the royal box, bow, curtsy, and then spill your guts all over the scarred and sacred lawn. For 2 weeks, or as they call it, a fortnight, the best players in the world serve and volley, chase and retrieve, and in the process create some lasting images. And that's our offering for you now. We serve it up. The 20 most memorable Wimbledon matches of all time as voted by ESPN Classic.
20.
He's probably known more for that Billie Jean King match than how great of a tennis player he was, but he was a sensational tennis player.
20.
34 years before his celebrated match with Billie Jean King, in a display of put your money where your mouth is self-confidence, Bobby Riggs bet on himself to win the singles, doubles, and mixed doubles. In his only Wimbledon appearance, he did, rallying to take the singles in 5 sets.
1939 Wimbledon, Bobby Riggs, great gamesman, great sportsman, really knew how to work the angles. Bets on himself to win the singles. Bets on himself to win the doubles. And for the heck of it, throws in the mixed doubles.
We got maybe 66 to 1 and bet $2,000.
He won all 3. That's a pretty remarkable record.
Bobby Riggs was a great character, and he was such a clever, cunning competitor. He used to bet on himself. He made no secret of the fact. In fact, he wrote a book about it. I think it was called Tennis is My Racket. He was a hustler, all right.
The tournament that year was the essence of Bobby Riggs. Before he's ever played there before, he's already betting on himself to win. That's Bobby.
19.
Strange things were happening at Wimbledon that year. Very strange things. But the Goran story was just unbelievable.
19.
3-time runner-up Goran Ivanisevic and his cannonball serve broke through at last in 2001. The Croatian southpaw detonated a tournament record 213 aces, and with his triumph over Patrick Rafter, became the only wild card to win at Wimbledon.
Goran Ivanisevic for so many years was the Buffalo Bills of Wimbledon. He lost 3 finals, 2 of them in 5 agonizing sets.
He's a guy who's ranked 125 in the world. He phones up the All England club, says, go on, please can I have a wild card? And they say, oh, seeing as it's you, yes, of course you can.
A lot of us thought that he was past his prime, but he still had this one last shot, to do it.
Finally, Goran is delivered. He wins the Wimbledon that he's tried to win his whole career.
It was great, except I was one of the guys he beat. I'm glad that Goran will be remembered as a Wimbledon champion because he's definitely a great grass court player.
18.
There was one passage of play that really encapsulates the fighting spirit of both of those women. As often happened, Steffi won.
18.
Steffi Graf, lover of the lawn, and Arantxa Sanchez Vicario, lover of the clay, were tied 5-5 in the 3rd set of the '95 final. The decisive 11th game produced 32 points and 13 deuces. Graf won and then swept the final game.
That was the match of the stupendous game, which seemed to go on for about 3.5 weeks.
Standing ovation, an incredible game.
A match comes down to this incredible deadlock. If Arantxa lost her serve, that Steffi was almost inevitably going to serve out the match.
Sanchez Vicario never liked playing on grass all that much, so for her to be in the finals of Wimbledon was a huge occasion.
Vicario was a clay court player, and so her game was endurance, keep the ball in play, but I would never bet against Steffi Graf on grass.
You never really thought that Arantxa Sanchez Vicario would ever become a Wimbledon champion.
Steffi Graf proved once and for all that she was the queen of women's tennis, and Arantxa Sanchez Vicario found a glass ceiling.
There are two things really mattered to Pete Sampras. That was winning Grand Slams and maintaining the #1 ranking. Oh. He expected to win Wimbledon.
17.
98, men's final. Pete Sampras against laser-serving Goran Ivanisevic. The Croat fired 32 aces, but also double-faulted 20 times. Sampras, with a dozen aces of his own, won in 5 sets, 6-2 in the final.
That match, I think, was 2 backhands. Poor old Goran went for them.
Ooh, just out.
He missed them. He didn't go 2 sets to love up. That let Sampras back in again.
Sampras had that kind of champion's instinct that came to its fore at Wimbledon. And to beat him in a Wimbledon final, well, no one did it. Wimbledon at some level becomes an unbelievably and unbearable mental struggle, and it's almost like a gunfight where who's going to blink first. If memory serves me correct, Pete was pretty good at those big situations. It was just another example of why Sampras is quite possibly the finest Wimbledon player there's ever been.
16. 16. 16.
At the time, female tennis desperately needed something fresh, new, bright. And like a flash of sunlight, along came Maria Sharapova.
16. 16.
Maria Sharapova learned English in 4 months. She learned tennis with equal facility, and in 2004 became the first Russian to win Wimbledon, upsetting 2-time defending champion Serena Williams in straight sets, with returns clocked at more than 100 miles per hour.
I think everyone went into that match expecting Williams to win. Absolutely everyone except Maria Sharapova.
I thought I was playing really, really well throughout the whole tournament, and if I could beat Lindsay Davenport, I thought, you know, why can't I beat Serena Williams?
This was a Russian beauty who had been Americanized, coming up against the fearsome Serena Williams. She unleashed her forehands, she dominated, she shrieked, she didn't look back.
She was so bold in her shot making and so certain of herself, and I think she astounded everyone, not excluding Serena.
It was incredible. I was in shock because it was my favorite Grand Slam for such a long time. Just to win it, it meant a lot to me.
She's a champion, and she's going to win Wimbledon again.
15. 15. 15.
Smith versus Nastase was like good versus evil. It was like the dark poet from Romania versus the upstanding kid from California. And it was just wonderful, wonderful tennis.
1972 final. Tied at 4-4 in the 5th, Stan Smith was serving down love 30. Ilia Nastase blistered a forehand that looked like a sure winner, but with a desperate lunge, the American got the very top of the wooden racket frame on the ball, just enough to notch the point. Then he went on to win the set 7-5 for the title.
Nastase was nothing if not a trickster, and he pulled them all that day.
He talked to his opponents, he talked to the linesmen, he talked to the crowd. He was a character, and whatever he had to do to win, he would.
On the other side of the court was one of the nice guys and fantastic champion, Stan Smith.
Stan had the ability not to be disturbed or irritated by Nastase, and Stan owned Nastase.
I remember Stan Smith leaping the net, and grabbing Nastase, and hugging him.
In the end, it was Smith that prevailed because he was the stronger mentally.
Stan was a tremendous competitor, and against Nastase, he just knew how to play. He had Nastase's number.
14.
One of the oldest stories and one of the most continuous narratives in tennis is choking.
It's got to be one of the biggest chokes in Wimbledon history.
Complete meltdown. Advantage, Miss Graf.
Victory was on her racket as Jana Novotná was 1 point from going up 5-1 in the 3rd set of the '93 final. But the Czech then lost 21 of the last 28 points and went from overwhelming lead to overwhelmed emotionally.
It
It should have been Jana Novotna's title. She was doing everything right, and then suddenly everything started to fall apart.
She was so nervous. I never saw a person so nervous in my life. And she's way ahead.
The worst thing a tennis player can do is think they've won a match. And Novotna, I think in her mind, she saw the trophy in her hands. And that's fatal. And all the things that she was doing naturally, she began to get jerky. But Graf, the remorseless player that she was, kept going and kept going and kept going. And bit by bit, Novotna fell apart.
We ended up watching that match not impressed by Graf, but in awe of how awful Novotna was.
Graf wins, poor Novotna's called forward, and the Duchess of Kent obviously said something that triggered the tears. And that image that flew around the world of the royal consoling the Czech is something that you'll never forget.
13, 13, 13.
There are some matches that you see which you remember almost every stroke of because the brilliance of the tennis is such that it leaves you gasping.
What a wonderful shot.
Such a match was Bjorn Borg and Vitas Gerulaitis 1977 semi-final.
13.
Sparring partners and friends, Bjorn Borg and Vitas Gerulaitis found themselves opponents. After the fifth game of the fifth set, Gerulaitis led for the first time. Later, he held match point, but stroked a backhand long. Borg rallied and won the set, 8-6.
Borg had won Wimbledon. He was the defending champion. It was ice that flowed through Bjorn Borg's veins.
You're talking about player Borg that was absolutely dominant, and you were talking about player Gerulaitis who had the talent. Did he have the application? Probably not. The Borg-Gerulaitis semi-final was probably the greatest sustained display of brilliant shot-making by two players that you could ever want to see.
Yes.
Both guys played at maximum level, fifth gear all the way through, and Borg happened to win.
That proved to everybody again just how outstanding Borg was and how in order to beat him on any surface you had to have more than just great talent, you had to have superhuman talent. Vitas didn't have it.
12.
When I first started watching tennis when I was a young girl, my favorite players were Chris Evert and Ivan Goolagong.
12.
Tied with Ivan Goolagong at 4-all in the third set of the 76 final, Chris Evert was encouraged in body language by some of her peers to abandon her customary baseline position and attack. She did, but then fell behind 6-5 before rallying to win the last 3 games for the match.
Goolagong's a much-loved figure, obviously, in Australia, because long before Cathy Freeman did it in athletics, she really put Aboriginal sport and Aboriginal achievement on the agenda in Australia.
You couldn't have asked for a better matchup of opposites. With Goolagong, she ran like a young deer, hardly ever seemed like any G-forces on the ground, and Chrissy, who just pounded it out.
Both women were at the top of their games and in their primes, and it was certainly one of the great grass court wins of Chris Evert's career.
76 was pretty well my best year, and I'd beaten Chris sort of most matches that I'd played that year, except for the main ones, really.
I remember that very vividly. I'd beaten Yvonne in a real tough 3-set match.
I didn't play as well as I had during the whole year against her. It was one of the really tough matches.
11.
You look in the record books, and Margaret Court's name comes up time and time again.
There's a school of thought that Margaret Court is the finest woman player ever to play the game.
11.
In 1970, Margaret Court and Billie Jean King slugged it out in a 2-set marathon that ground on for 46 games, a record for the women's final. With her injured foot numbed and taped, the resolute Aussie prevailed 14-12, 11-9, and went on to win the Grand Slam.
There was incredible rivalry between Court and King.
There was this big, tall, muscular Australian athlete, and there was this short, bespectacled American fighter.
Billie Jean King and Margaret Court produced an absolute beauty because they were both at their peak, despite both being injured.
They were kind of staggering around the court as if they were something out of one of these Rocky movies where, well, who's gonna go down first? And Court had a little bit more firepower.
When Margaret Court played and Billie Jean King played, no tiebreaks, so you had to be that extra bit mentally tough because sets could go on forever. I'm glad that the tiebreak was brought into the game because I don't think I could have lasted all those sets being that long.
The fact that it was so close, it went so long, I think stands the test of time, and it's a milestone in women's tennis.
10.
Player suspended.
When Pat played Pete in the final, it was plagued by disappointing weather.
A lot of pressure on Pete, trying to break his record.
It was one of those nights when you're just so grateful that you were there. Because history was in the making.
10.
Neither rain nor dark nor injury could keep Pete Sampras from his appointment with history in 2000. The hobbling American's 27 aces against Patrick Rafter helped him raise his finals record at Wimbledon to 7-0 and propelled him to a record 13th Grand Slam singles title.
He was really struggling mentally and really feeling the burden of the pressure to try to break the record.
This was a real tough fortnight for Sampras, probably as tough as his whole career at any Grand Slam. He had to get injections in his shin before every match. He wasn't even practicing.
He was playing basically with a wooden leg. It was a difficult final. There were rain delays, it went on. We were almost cooled off because of darkness. Here you had Patrick Rafter, great serve volleyer from Australia, trying to win Wimbledon and had the greatest game for it, going against the best player ever, especially at Wimbledon.
Australia stayed up all night to watch this. This was a great opportunity for Rafter to win a Wimbledon. Pete just pulled out something magical when he really had to.
It was pretty emotional, and to see Pete's family, his parents were there to come over to watch him break the record was pretty spectacular.
When the winning point goes in, he started to cry. And that was something that nobody had ever seen before.
He had been sharing the record with Roy Emerson of 12 Grand Slam singles titles, and he had broken it by beating an Australian. He wasn't the most popular person in Australia at that time.
You couldn't ask for a more impeccable display of great tennis. And, you know, Rafter was just a foil to Sampras' greatness that day.
9.
He was my first rivalry to where we created more than just the game. His attitude versus my attitude. His strengths versus my strengths.
9.
Bjorn Borg was as cool as ice. Jimmy Connors wore his heart on his racket, and lava flowed through his veins. Tied at 4-all in the 5th set of the 77 final, the American double faulted, lost his serve, and the stoic Swede swept a love game for his second title.
Borg was absolutely imperturbable in adversity.
I could never pick anything up on him. I never got a feel of any emotion from him. He always kept the same look on his face, continued to play the same level of tennis.
That was my style of play on the court. You know, never open my mouth, stay calm, doesn't matter if something happened on the court.
And I've talked to him about that. I said, one time, just toss your racket down. You know, he said, no, I won't do it, no.
Connors is like foaming to kill this guy. But Borg is a great player.
A beautiful pass.
At that time, people thought, well, how can a guy playing from the baseline, you know, win Wimbledon again for a second time? Well, we all know what ended up happening.
That was a sign that, you know, the American grip on tennis was broken.
Borg proved that patience and guts outlasted the aggressor.
8.
The 87 semi between Chris and Martina really was emblematic of their entire rivalry.
Advantage, Miss Navratilova?
It's probably the enduring rivalry in women's tennis for the last 30, 40 years.
They met for the 73rd time. Martina Navratilova's power against Chris Evert's finesse. Navratilova won the third set 6-4, lifting her record over her rival to 12-3 in Grand Slam tournaments since 1980.
Navratilova and Evert. I mean, you're talking at the scale of Red Sox, Yankees, USC, UCLA, and of course to meet at Wimbledon, the greatest venue of them all.
The rivalry with Chris and I, everything was a contrast. She played feminine tennis, and I played masculine tennis.
Navratilova, she just ruled Wimbledon. There was an edge to the games they played, and this was probably their best match.
It was still largely about how well Chris could pass and how well Martina could serve and volley, and the counter-attacking of Evert versus the attacking skills of Navratilova.
And the contrast in styles between the attacking Navratilova and the counter-punching Evert really made for just some great tennis.
There were times when they both were wondering about should they continue, as retirement looming, and then the other one would put on a spurt. So hang on, if she's doing it, I'll do it.
Without each other, those two would never have been as great as they were. They just kept raising the stakes on each other. And as they kept raising each other's games, they raised the whole sport.
7, 7, 7, 7.
Althea Gibson, a tall, fast-moving player, powerful and always on the attack.
7, 7.
Defeating Darlene Hard in straight sets in 1957, a tearful Althea Gibson became the first African-American Wimbledon champion. She played with a style her opponents called devastating, but the impact of her triumph spread far beyond tennis.
Althea really set the pace for serve and volley, which I just loved. I loved to watch Althea play.
She had a huge reach, of course. Difficult woman to pass because she would leap out and hit her volleys so well. And in that final against Darlene Hard, she played quite beautifully.
He was this child who'd come from Harlem, battled against everything you could possibly battle against, and came through and won the title on centre court at Wimbledon, kind of the bastion of English high class. And this black girl from America had conquered everything and won it in style.
Althea Gibson winning Wimbledon that year was really a seminal moment in the civil rights movement. That's the same year as the Montgomery bus boycott. You're still a few years away from even civil rights legislation being passed in America. And to see someone coming from the streets of Harlem to win Wimbledon, quite an amazing development.
You could argue that it inspired a generation of African Americans to take up tennis, to play tennis. We almost reap the rewards of that later on, 20, 30 years later, with Zina Garrison, and then going beyond that with the Williams sisters. And so it's a hugely significant moment in the history of African American sport.
6, 6, 6.
Chrissy Evert, the Ice Maiden, so disciplined on a tennis court, coming up against Martina Navratilova.
6.
Probably the greatest rivalry in women's tennis.
One of sport's most riveting rivalries was joined in the '78 final. Martina Navratilova and Chris Evert. Navratilova, trailing 5-4 in the third set, won 12 of the next 13 points to take the first of her record 9 Wimbledon singles titles.
My first time I saw Martina was in a tournament on the USTA Tour in Florida. First of all, she's about 50 pounds overweight. She came over really chunky, you know, this fat little Czechoslovakian girl. And she had all this jewelry draped around her neck and her bracelets and rings. I chuckled. I just thought, oh my God, we're a lot different.
He was Chris, very feminine, girl next door, dainty fingernails, playing pretty tennis.
At this stage, Navratilova was relatively unknown, relatively young, only 21, still playing under the Czechoslovakian nationality.
This was the ultimate matchup in the serve volleyer from the communist country against a stoic American. It was remarkable the way they just pushed each other.
There's Martina down 4-2 in the third set, and people are thinking, well, that's a nice effort she made. Chris is probably going to win. And then like that, Navratilova ends up winning the match.
Game, set, and match to Miss Navratilova.
Some think she's the greatest player of all time, period, but certainly must be considered the greatest woman grass court player of all time. And this was the beginning of that run.
5-5-5.
You cannot be serious! That ball was on the line. Chalk flew up.
He was totally out of control the entire time. He was going to do everything he could to win a tennis match, and he didn't care what he said or what he did. By all odds, he probably should have been thrown out of the tournament 3 different days.
After 41 straight Wimbledon wins and 5 straight Wimbledon titles, Bjorn Borg met his match in 1981. In a rematch of the previous year's thrilling final, John McEnroe defeated Borg. Borg retired at the end of that season, and McEnroe assumed his place on the throne.
This was the super brat year, and he was an incredibly larger-than-life character.
He is a guy that I think doesn't hold much respect, but he held total respect for Borg.
He kept himself on so-called normal level on the court. And I think that's because of the respect we have of each other.
This is the rematch at Wimbledon. McEnroe was clearly at the top of his game as Borg was his.
Borg was my favorite player, and I wanted him to do it one more time. It was tough to watch.
Revenge is sweet, and it was very, very sweet for McEnroe.
That Wimbledon final in '81 was sort of the beginning of the end of Borg. He could tell that there was someone now that wasn't intimidated by him and that maybe had the type of game that was going to bother him a lot.
It was the beginning of a new generation with McEnroe.
4.
Pancho, at about 2-1 in the second set, started complaining to the referee that it was getting dark.
Well, why can't we wait? Why should we play when I can't see the ball?
Gonzalez tried to get the match called because of darkness, and it really wasn't dark.
Match goes on.
4.
1969, first round, instant history. Pancho Gonzalez, 41, played Charlie Pasarell, 25, and played, and played, and played. Pasarell finally won the first set 24-22. After he also took the second, darkness forced their match into a second day.
Suddenly, people saw this epic confrontation on centre court.
Pancho Gonzalez had this great desire. He would kill anyone who stood in his way of winning a tennis match.
And here was Charlie Pasarell, one of the world's really nice guys, but with really serious game.
I had the younger legs, and he had the older legs, so I figured I'll tire him.
At one point in the match, Gonzalez yelled at Pasarell. He says, "Charlie, I know what you're doing. I know you're trying to get me tired with those chip returns and those lobs, but I'm going to tell you, it's not working."
It was quite remarkable to see the skill still there in those 40-year-old legs. He just refused to lose.
And finally, the old guy won, which was quite incredible.
Gonzalez won the last 3 sets, including 11-9 in the 5th. All told, 112 games in 5 hours and 12 minutes. Longest Wimbledon match ever.
At the time, I had no idea that it would be a match that people would remember. In fact, I wish they wouldn't have remembered it because I lost it.
3.
With McEnroe and Connors, you pretty much knew that you weren't going to be disappointed from the time the first ball was struck.
3.
Jimmy Connors' old lion against John McEnroe, young brat. 8 years after his first Wimbledon title, Connors summoned that old magic to win a 5-set thriller. 7-6, 6-4 the last 2 sets in a match that took more than 4 hours.
The great thing about tennis is, even though they're not throwing punches, the best sports are me against you. One-on-one sports. You know, my best against your best. Let's see who wins.
A lot of people had more or less written me off, that I would never win Wimbledon again. You know, self-doubt was also creeping into my own mind at the time.
Connors was the street fighter, was the guy that just refused to give up. He was like a dog with a bone. He wouldn't let go, and he wanted to beat the upstart down the other end more than anything.
Neither one of them was at the best that day. Connors, though, was just the ultimate in guts and courage and would not let himself get beaten.
You know, in '82, Connors did what people thought would be no longer possible in men's tennis. He made a big comeback after he had been clearly lapped by the top level of competition.
Nobody thought he could ever be #1 again. Connors had the second act of his career that neither Borg nor McEnroe ever had.
2-2-2-2.
In the 1975 final, Jimmy Connors ran into Arthur Ashe, the same man he just sued for libel. The two were feuding about Connors' refusal to join the ATP and play for the U.S. Davis Cup team. Ashe, a 10-1 underdog, won 12 of the first 14 games and became the first male African-American Wimbledon champion.
There was a real antipathy there, and very hard for Arthur to dislike anybody, but he really didn't like Jimmy Connors.
Arthur Ashe had been the most magnificent hitter of a tennis ball, but this day it all changed.
Connors fed off pace. He loved it when you gave him pace. Ashe gave him none. A lot of lobs, a lot of chips, mixing it up. Connors was as shocked as everyone else.
He'd figured out he could slice his serve at a nice angle to Connors' two-handed backhand. Jimmy had trouble returning that ball, and Arthur was right there at the net, just batting the volleys either way.
He drove Connors bonkers by sitting there meditating during the changeovers, and Connors, being the volatile character that he is, it just drove him nuts and helped Arthur win.
Connors was getting more and more frustrated. Somebody in the crowd, I remember, yelled, "Come on, Connors!" And he turned in frustration to them and yelled, "I'm trying, for Christ's sake!"
2 championship points for Arthur Ashe.
A black man had out-thunk a brilliant young white player in the biggest event in tennis.
He won with his intelligence. He played a perfect game. His strategy was perfect, and there was nothing that Connors could do.
Well, we've shown 19 memorable matches, and I've done the math, which means that all that's left is the most memorable of the most memorable, our number one.
1-1-1.
It was a terribly wet Wimbledon, and so it was sort of almost a surprise. And then this absolutely brilliant flower just opened before your eyes.
It was tennis from the gods.
Bjorn Borg, 4-time champion against John McEnroe in his first Wimbledon final.
It had all the trappings of a great heavyweight prize fight. The contrasting styles, Sweden versus New York, left-hander versus right-hander.
Borg is the champion, McEnroe is the guy on the make.
I started off great. I won the first set easily. I was in control, and I think I was almost like, this is too easy. It's happening too easy. And once I thought that, he sort of snuck in mentally and started to play better and better. You know, the thing's almost over, and I'm able to regroup and get it into a tiebreaker.
This tiebreak has taken on iconic significance. It's worthy of it. Time stood still.
This tiebreaker started 6-all, 7-all, 8-all, and I have match points. And John is coming up with these unbelievable shots all the time.
That fourth set tiebreaker took 34 points to resolve. McEnroe saved 5 match points, winning 18-16, but at great physical cost.
I felt that I had more pressure than he had in the tiebreaker, though. Because, you know, I'm not panicking, but still, this is my match. I cannot slip away my match.
It wasn't just the fact that they were saving match points and set points, you know, in that famous tiebreak. It was the way they were doing it. Every shot was a winner.
When I lost the tiebreaker, I was very disappointed in myself. I won this set. I won this match. And here I'm still sitting, changing side.
Now it's a matter of heart.
I was tired. I played some tough matches, but I thought he was going to, like, pack it in. But instead, he seemed to sort of pick it up physically a notch.
After this extraordinary, excruciating tiebreaker was perfect tennis. I mean, it was just perfect. I mean, it should have broken Borg's heart. And he just came out and he just played like a machine.
Borg won 28 of the last 29 points on his serve, taking the riveting fifth set 8-6. That concluded the 55-game epic. Borg the winner, as were all who saw it.
After the match, it was just like a relief. I was too scared to think what I would do if I lost that match.
My brother knew that he arrived even in a losing effort.
And it proved once again that Borg winning his fifth straight Wimbledon was the once-and-future king of Wimbledon. But it also let him know that this guy McEnroe wasn't too far from him.
The legacy of the Borg-McEnroe 1980 Wimbledon match is very simple. It was the single most important, most popular moment the sport had in the 20th century.
Strawberries and cream, gathering storms, and Noah's Ark rain delays, and grass courts that, by the end, are worn down to their roots. These are all images of Wimbledon. And, of course, bare-knuckle, bloody-nosed tennis, as you've seen. We think we've got it right, but just to make sure, we're inviting a critique of ESPN Classic's list by our resident second-guessers. Mike out, Greenberg, and Mike out, Golick.
All right, Golick, I think that to begin with, in honor of the sport we are here to discuss, we should do it in a whisper because we do not want to affect the players out there and their intense concentration.
I've always wanted to change that rule. They did it in bowling. You can now hoop and holler when they're going to throw the bowling ball. I'd love to see it happen in tennis and in golf, but we got to be so prim and proper.
I would like to say that you are the first person ever to equate tennis and bowling, and the people involved in tennis are disgusted with you for it.
Well, because I can do them both well, my friend.
All right, Golick, Borg-McEnroe in the final in 1980 is not only the greatest tennis match I've ever seen, it's one of the 3 or 4 greatest sporting events I've ever seen. That was as unforgettable as anything I've ever watched. The drama, McEnroe, the kid who you didn't know that. I mean, he was really just bursting onto the scene. Borg, of course, who was already a legendary figure and had won at Wimbledon so many times. That, to me, is definitely the greatest tennis match I ever saw. And among, I think, safe to say, among the 5 greatest sporting events I ever watched.
And I agree, absolutely agree, as a #1 match of all time, maybe one of the greatest sporting events of all time, of what those guys went through. And then what impresses me is #5 on the list. You go the other way when McEnroe beat Borg and ended his streak of, 5 straight Wimbledons and 41 straight wins, matches won at Wimbledon. So, those 2 guys right up there in the top 5.
And the enormity of the figures of McEnroe and his personality. Missing from this list, not enough Williams sisters representation. Yep. The Williams sisters and what they did to tennis in a short period. Now, I would have thought that run was going to last a little longer, and we'll see where they go from here. But what the Williams sisters did to tennis, and did at Wimbledon in particular, is an enormous, significant event, and I think the Williams sisters need to be higher on this list.
Significant, and you know what, by the way? They can play some great tennis as well.
No question about it. But all things considered, we must very quietly applaud the people who made the choice. Borg-McEnroe, #1.
And that'll do it for this edition of Who's Number One. Thanks for joining us for ESPN Classic's ranking of the 20 most memorable Wimbledon matches of all time. We will be back to continue our countdown of the athletes, the teams, and the events that have shaped our world in sports. Until then, I'm Trey Wingo. Let the debating begin.